I think we still have people coming in, but I would like to get started more or less, well, almost on time for this event here tonight at Carnegie Europe. Thanks a lot for coming to all of you here on this evening. When the Euromaidan revolution took place and a new government came into office in Ukraine, something very interesting happened, something that the Europeans were not really used to. There was actually a government in its neighborhood that wanted to implement reforms. That's something that the European neighborhood, policy was not quite used to. And so everybody was just holding their breath, for some time. And actually everybody is still holding their breath, and that's why we're here tonight. The strategic significance of the reform process in Ukraine is extremely important for EU foreign policy, because the Ukraine crisis and the subsequent measures that were taken really forms, and in our opinion here at Carnegie Europe, the perhaps biggest foreign policy test that the EU has ever been put to, because it's of such enormous political importance and strategic importance, but also because the EU really sided very early on with one camp, and the EU put a huge bet on the reform success of that particular new government. Basically, European strategic success in the Ukraine situation depends very much on the success of the Poroshenko government to turn the country around. And not only around in one field or two fields, but to turn it around in a wide array of policy fields, all of which are humongously difficult on their own, but which form a formidable kind of network of problems that need to be tackled if you take them all together. And because the strategic importance for Europe is so big, but not only for us, but also for the United States side in all of this, Carnegie decided, in cooperation between the Brussels office here and the Russia-Eurasia program in Washington, to set up the Ukrainian Reform Monitor, which is this product that we will be talking about a little bit today. It's a document that we publish roughly every other month, and which attempts to provide a real assessment on how progress is going on these various policy fields. These documents look quite unassuming. They look like this, which doesn't look like much, I guess, but it's 6 pages full of dynamite. Because what it does is that it looks at everything from judicial and political reform to economic reform, to security sector reform, basically to everything that you need to change in a country in a relatively short period of time. And it does so by not just looking at the surface, so what's actually in Parliament, what's in the radar, what's being discussed, but also looks at, does a qualitative assessment in terms of, is this on the right track, how far has it progressed? So when you read these 6 pages every other month, you get a fairly good idea, what's going on and where the problems still lie and where progress can actually really be seen. And I think this is the effort that we want to make. And to that end, what we have done and what Balázs has done, Balázs Jarábik, who's sitting right next to me, who's a Carnegie fellow, Balázs has really put together a fantastic small research team in Ukraine on the ground that assesses this progress. So this is Ukrainian scholars themselves on the ground to do this, not people sitting in their remote safe offices here in Brussels or elsewhere. And I will just read the names to you so that we can give them credit once more, because they're working very hard to actually make this possible. These people are Mikhail Minakov, Alexander Zholut, Anastasia Loikina, Yuri Jigir, and Katarina Mainsyuk. It's great that they're not in the building because they can't punish me for my pronunciation. But that's the team, and Balázs runs them. And Balázs is here today also to present to us the findings from the first 2 issues of the Reform Monitor. And then we have 2 other speakers here to comment and to give us further insight. One is Oksana Movchan, who is working in the Ukrainian President's office. She's working for the National Reform Council meeting, which is basically the steering body, if I understand this correctly, for the overall reform effort, presided over by President Poroshenko, but with all kinds of stakeholders from across Ukraine being parts of it. It's really the kind of heart chamber of the Ukrainian reform effort. And we would like to hear from Oksana what the inside perspective on all of this is, but perhaps also a little bit of an assessment of what she thinks the Europeans are doing right and perhaps not doing so right when it comes to the Ukrainian reform effort. And then we have Pierre Vimont with us, who of course is now a Carnegie scholar, currently on leave because he's putting together a big summit on the refugee situation between African countries and the European Union, but who's found the time in his busy schedule to come over and to look also perhaps at the European side a little bit, comment on the findings, and then give us a bit of an assessment as to where, from a European perspective, this all stands. This evening is of significance for another reason as well, because we're testing a new sound system tonight. In the first 4 minutes of this event, it has worked flawlessly. We've just installed it today. It's all digital and hyper and super and technological mostly. And I've heard fantastic sounds all day coming from this wonderful little machine that's over here. I hope it will not, leave us in the lurch, but, perform flawlessly. So give us and cut us some slack if something goes wrong. It's the first time we're testing this. You are our beta testers for this. And then, as you know, as always with Carnegie, what we will be doing is a very short reception afterwards. It will take about 3 minutes for us to remove all of the chairs, and then that part of the building will be open for wine and small snacks, and then hopefully you can continue the discussion, and hopefully also our panelists will then be there for you for further questions. That's all I can say at this moment. Thanks again to all of you for coming. Balázs, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Jan. A great hospitality, and always happy to be at Carnegie in Brussels. I'm attached to the DC as a visiting scholar, the DC office, but I'm rarely visiting DC as well. I'm still living in the Baltics now, but pretty much commuting to Eastern Europe a lot. And this is essentially something, the project and also the team is something which kind of stemming from my 6-year experience where I was living in Kyiv and working on mostly civil society projects, not for the European side, but for the American side, just for the background and for the sake of transparency. What I was thinking is essentially going not through the findings necessarily, because I think these are self-explanatory. I'm going to give you a few words about assessment based on those, where the reform process are. And then I was looking for the freshest polling, public opinion polling, so what the Ukrainians think about the reform process, because I do believe that, and this is not my job, but like in the West, we Europeans often looking at Ukraine as we would like to see it as actually as Ukraine is. And this is kind of leading toward the same mistakes, kind of competing with Russia, obviously, but the same mistakes to believe instead of to check. And one of the things which we were kind of the ambition of this memo is providing a reality check, not that much on Ukraine, but also for policymakers in the West. That's why it's short, because people can read it. And when you take a look at the overall assessment, it's only 3 paragraphs, which, that's something, I think everybody should read. Last thing, procedure-wise, I think we need to highlight also Richard Youngs, who is the main editor. And that's really like the material which we are receiving from the field is much bigger in volume. And we have to go through it to put it into a comprehensive package like this, as you see, and that's mostly his editing. So what is happening? We already over a year and almost a year and a half in the reform process, and obviously, when you're reading through the memo, the question is where you look at it, whether this is a glass half full or half empty. Mine, my own, I was surprised, and we were surprised at Carnegie that the actual picture is more positive than we expected. Okay, fair enough. Our expectations were perhaps lower than most of the policymakers in the West, but still, we were even, I thought that we were maybe too critical or more critical towards Ukraine than essentially the reforms are happening. The reforms are happening. The issue is that Ukraine needs to get, and here's Oksana who will talk about 18 different priorities, reform priorities, which is almost impossible to do. And one of the problem or the challenge is how to make 18 different reforms with the government bureaucracy, who was doing something totally different in the past 25 years. For me, the Maidan was essentially the collapse of the post-Soviet institutions, and the challenge is how to build new ones. And the big challenge for Ukraine, it's still a hesitation whether to build new ones in a few ways is happening, like the new petrol police, right? Or reform the old ones. And most of the bureaucrats simply have no idea what these reforms are actually entail. And not only most of the bureaucrats, but let me give you immediately a polling number. The overwhelming majority of Ukraine do not even believe in the success of reforms. 32% have certain hopes, and 30% are totally hopeless. Only 30% believe that the reforms will be successful. So the Ukrainians essentially have a very realistic or down-to-earth view whether this government can deliver something. I can also quote other, like those who are engaged into the policy reforms just made a very fresh poll, and there is obviously an overwhelming success, even by public opinion. People like it. People do increase trust over the new police. This is something which delivering service with more integrity, and this is just something which is also very visible, also because they had the blue lights on all the time, out of Georgia, but it's a separate story. So obviously the main thing is, you know, and if you're going to see, we're kind of measuring, we picked up sectors for one particular reason, 4 sectors, not NT sectors, because that would be, I believe, too much to read. But 4 sectors, because one of the things which I, as a practitioner, we're always missing is essentially a more sectoral approach vis-a-vis, I mean, from those who are trying to aid and support the reforms. Unless we actually see what's happening on the ground based on these sectors, we cannot really aid those processes. And here I think it's fantastic, and Oksana is going to talk about the new emerging institutions who are pushing the reforms, like the National Reform Council. Forward, this is something very new, it never happened, so it also gives certain hopes or higher hopes that this reform process are ongoing. So what's the main issue, what's the main challenges? Well, beyond the old bureaucracy, and the other thing is that the new Ukraine, as we would like to see it, is a minority. A bigger minority than I used to be, like, let's say 5 years ago, but still a minority. Just consider, out of the 450 MPs, only 30 are in that pro-European group, right? Those who essentially are committed, 30. So that is a real sense, just to give you a real sense, how much we're talking about the minority. That is a growing percentage in a minority, of this minority, but still in a minority. So it's very important what kind of tactic a minority within this majority, which either do not understand or not capable or not willing to support, talking about the government, but also a lot of politicians can entail. The second challenge is the ongoing corruption and the rent-seeking. That's something, unfortunately, have not changed. Most of the anti-reform, anti-corruption efforts are formal. All structures are effectively, like the Prosecutor General, essentially blocking it. You know, it's very funny even, although I think it's tragic, that even Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has a case against himself for $3 million bribe, but nobody was convicted in a year and a half. And unless Ukraine start producing credible cases, not only selective justice, politically or otherwise, then people who do not trust that anything is going on in the corruption, essentially will turn and increase the trust in the new government that they're going to do it. Last but not least, I already talk about, you know, the distance, the debate between proponents and opponents. Here, I think it's very important to address one thing, that there are these emerging institutions which are embedded into the government who are trying to facilitate the reforms. This is the National Reform Council, which Oksana is going to talk about. So the overall picture is we have progress with the low level of reforms. By the way, it's also very interesting that most of the visible progress has no legal grounds, like the Petro Police. At the same time, there are thousands of new legal acts which are not kind of bringing the new institutions or a mentality shift or change. So it's also a question what the tactic to change certain institutions would be. Last but not least, the biggest problem is, already mentioned, the coordination. Not only the coordination or the facilitation among those stakeholders who are engaged, but particularly among the Ukrainian stakeholders and those who are trying to help, particularly the EU. This is my critical remark toward the EU. We delivered that at the EES and the support group today as well. And particularly is the problem of the Ukrainian old habit of overpromising and under-delivering. And this is something, unfortunately, you know, in the West, I'm always trying to say, please do not trust. These people could be our partners, but, you know, when you want to believe and trust, there is the church and religion. This is policymaking, as, you know, Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. And we need to do much more of the verification if we want to help effectively. And again, this is the project which hopefully is helping. The last point, the lack of communication is from the government, the engagement with their own people, right? They're promising victories, as this is also an old habit, instead of hard work. And when you look at the polling, and I'm finishing up here, again, Ukrainians do not trust, so you don't need to promise, right? What Ukrainians would increase the trust over the reform process if the government would essentially promise them more hard work on their side. Here is an interesting polling result. 36% of the Ukrainians are ready to tolerate further decline in their income and standard of living, which is huge. By UN data, it's 80% of the Ukrainian people now live in poverty, which is $5 a day. So after Maidan, the living standard were rapidly down. By the way, also an interesting polling number for whom Ukrainians are blaming or holding responsible for this rapidly sliding living standards. 72% are blaming corruption. 54% are the oligarchization of the economy. 47% the incompetent administration, oligarchization of the economy. 47% of the incompetent administration, the government, and only 30% of the Donbas war, which is a big contradiction to what the government is trying to say and communicate. The last polling data here, only 9% of the Ukrainians are fully satisfied with the state of the government informing them about their own work. So this is the main challenge, increasing the communication, information, and even 39% of the citizens think that the information that the government provides often doesn't correspond to reality. So this is not me saying, this is the Ukrainian people are saying vis-a-vis public opinion polls. This is what the Europeans should take a little bit more seriously. And, and helping to those civil society and others who are trying to push the reforms forward, holding the government and those parts accountable. I think a lot of these things are happening, but it's not coordinated among the Western institutions side, not even at the EU institution side, right? And it's happening behind the closed doors. I think it must start happening, like the tough love, the critical engagement is the way forward if we want to help Ukraine. Thank you.
Balázs, thank you very much. Before I give the word to Oksana, I have one quick question to you.
Sure.
You're painting a relatively bleak picture, I have to say. I mean, we shouldn't trust, the promises. Corruption is still rampant. Only a minority is dedicated to the reform effort. Really, Ukrainians don't expect very much, and 80% of Ukrainians are living in poverty. And yet you're saying that there's progress. Yet you're saying that there's more than you at Carnegie, the experts, expected. How do you square that? Give us a little bit, just a slightly better feeling of where the progress is, because the picture looks so bleak.
Well, if you take a look at the monitoring report, there is progress in every field. But particularly, there is no progress in two fields. And there is judiciary, and the corruption. And this is, I think, the other progress vis-a-vis this, because this is shaping the reality and the context, not only for me, but mostly for the Ukrainians, as we see in the public opinion result. This is what's saying the Ukrainians that after the Maidan, there was not a significant change among those, the ruling elite, who are promised this change to happen, right? After so many people died and Ukrainians sacrificed so much for change. So, the reality is, as I see it, that we're back into an oligarch-run Ukraine. Now, whether we could avoid an oligarch-run Ukraine, I think it was not realistic. So we essentially have to stick with this government simply because we're not going to have any better. So the task is how we can get the best or more, at least, for the sake of Ukrainians out of this government. And trusting people who, running dubious businesses, monopolies, are not the best way, or not the best start. That's it.
So how to get best out of this current government, Oksana? I guess that's probably you we're talking about, right? Give us your version of the situation, please.
Okay, just a few words. I'm representing the Secretariat of National Reform Council. This is the high-level meeting which takes place every 2 weeks with participation always of the President, Prime Minister, head of Verkhovna Rada, all the cabinet, heads of political parties who are members of coalition, and also parliamentarians who are heads of parliamentary committees, and most importantly, for representatives of civil sector. What is the major idea behind the National Reform Council meeting? We are carefully watching, we are the Secretariat, it's like 3-4 people. We are carefully watching what is going on, and the NRC is the place where where the participants settle disputes. It's not the place where ministers delivering Politburo-style speeches. It's about understanding where the problems are in trying to solve these problems, to find solutions. My personal opinion, yeah, I am optimistic. I joined the government 4 years ago. So I would say this is the second wave, which occurred one year and a half. How I came, it will give you a bit more of understanding what I will say afterwards. I came as a result of two big consulting groups working for the government. It's Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey. They persuaded the government and the President Yanukovych that they need more people, new people embedded into the already existing institutions. So there were 20 people at the presidential administration and 5 people at Kyiv City State Administration. So I do have my own experience how to survive and how to be efficient in a complicated environment. And I want to comment on Balázs' comment that there are still very few people. But you know, believe me, 4 years ago, I would say there were none, and we were capable of of doing things. Now we have people in the government who are they are actually the top managers. The problem is that they are sometimes they're the only ones. I receive the comments from European colleagues that they are so pleased to see that the new faces which are representing representing Ukraine, who are capable of speaking English. They have Western education, so they are good mannered. They do know. They are competent in what they are doing. But actually, these people are really. What they lack is this middle management capacity. So sometimes they are the only ones within the ministries, and plus 2-3 people who they were able to bring with themselves from their previous jobs. So new people, I would say there are more of us now. The second thing that I would like to, as a plus here, as achievement, the new government, the coalition, develop the plans. I will not comment on the quality of these plans, but at least we have plans of 3 different levels. Strategic plan, we have operational plan, we have tactical plans. Another plus or another achievement, and here I'm talking about the place where I'm working now, I think we succeeded in organizing an inclusive dialogue. I should say that we already had 14 meetings. At first, people were misusing the idea and the purpose of this meeting. And the first meeting occurred in December. But during the last half year, the politicians understood that at this meeting we don't have any journalists. It's really like a gentleman's club. And now they start talking, we already fearing that some of the information can be leaked out. Sometimes they're discussing things which are really sensitive. And we already do have representatives of EU delegation to Ukraine. I do have comments on how the president acts or the prime minister. I'm not satisfied completely with the things that are going on, but I'm thinking already to them that they do not hide. They are ready to face, in front of other colleagues, they are ready to face very sharp remarks on behalf of the civil society. And sometimes we, as the secretariat who are responsible for bringing for inviting people, inviting different stakeholders, we are criticized, and someday we might be punished for inviting some people who, to opinion of some of the participants, should not appear at this meeting because they don't want to face these critics. So what are the challenges? What is not going the right way? Now I will comment on the plans. They still need, they are still more a show-off rather than a detailed action plan that could be implemented, or something that could be, where the success could be tracked. I support you with the statement that we need communication. The government, there should be two-way communication from the government to the people and from the people to the government. and also the question of accountability. I'm responsible within this secretariat, I'm responsible for, remarkably for monitoring framework which we developed together with the EU delegation to Ukraine. I will tell you a few words what it is. As Balázs already told, that Ukraine has 18 priority reforms. This is something which was decided by the National Reform Council meeting. I'm not the one who is responsible for content with my colleagues and also with the rest of the administration, but we are responsible for administering the meeting, the result of which, whose primary purpose is to agree upon certain things, upon certain steps. So the monitoring framework that we've developed, we call it scorecards. It's actually the set of indicators, around 20 or 30 for each of the 18 priority reforms. These indicators break into three groups. One group is actually the commitments that we took from this, from the five key documents that Ukraine has now. It's coalition agreement, it's strategy 2020, it's the government plan, and it's two international treaties that Ukraine has signed. One with EU, another one with IMF. So we took the commitments. Believe me, some of these documents, I'm talking about our documents, Ukrainian documents, they do have very discrete actions with responsible people and with the deadlines, especially in a coalition agreement. The deadlines are violated. We do have players within Ukrainian society who keep track of these commitments. So the first part is the commitments from the action plan. The second part of the scorecard is actually we track the impact. So if we do some actions, we implement reforms, we adopt laws, what happens as a result? Like we had so many car accidents at the beginning of the year, and this is how many we have at the end of the year. This is the place of Ukraine in doing business rating in 2015, and this is in 2016. And the third group of indicators are the perception indicators, and here the idea is to understand how the population perceive our efforts. Even if we are 100% right and we succeeded in our plans, still we need to know what is the opinion. So I probably will stop at this.
Oksana, I have one quick question, which has to do with something that Balázs said earlier, but which I think affects the work of the Council a great deal. When there are so few people truly dedicated to the reform effort, as you have also kind of alluded to, that there are now more people, but it's still not an awful lot. When you take those decisions, when these decisions are taken in the Reform Council, with so few agents of change that actually go out there and implement them, how do you assure implementation? How is the Council seeing to it that the stuff it decides also gets on the ground?
By limiting the questions which are, are raised at the National Reform Council meeting. We don't want it to be a show. Sometimes we could be criticized that let's take tax reform. It is an important thing, but we've been silent for more than 8 months because we didn't have anything to say. It's not about bringing very unpleasant things to the table and then delivering nothing. I mean, we are also stakeholders. I'm not interested, and the president and prime minister and the administration and cabinet, we are not interested in raising issues or blaming somebody or showing the red flags that we did not, we failed, here we failed. It's about, we bring issues only then when we understand what could be the roadmaps or what could be the resolutions. We also offer, we also offer solutions.
Let me ask a second question, which is closely related, and then I let you off the hook for the moment. That is the question of the sense of responsibility and accountability in that council. When these people are coming together from the various players in the country and they agree on a certain program, to what extent do they feel responsible? To what extent are they actually owners of these process? And how do they then come back after weeks and months, and report on progress? I mean, is there a sense of we can't fail, we must come back with a success to this group, or is it basically, let's convene and it doesn't really matter?
I would first comment. We do keep records. I mean, we publish everything that has been decided. I mean, it's in a short version, but everybody understands what has been discussed and what decisions were taken. But it's not about that. It's about key stakeholders in the country, really powerful people with a lot of power. They are given promises in front of. I mean, it's 35 people. It's a round table with 35 people sitting around it, plus an area of another 20 people who are, who are listening to the discussion. And they also can provide comments. So actually, if the question is asked, it is being asked, and people are invited to give their opinions or their decisions or their votes, they make sure. I mean, we make sure that all the rest hear their promises. It's like it's a gentleman's club. So if somebody said, I'm ready to do this, or I support it, I do not support it, we should, it creates some pressure for them.
All right. No, that's very interesting insight, I think, into the way that mechanic works. I'd like to hand it over to Pierre now. Pierre, if this is really so important for us, if our success depends on the success of the reforms in the country, then are we doing enough? Are we doing it well enough? How much input are we reasonably giving into this that matters?
I would like to rebound on what you were saying at the moment, this concept of a huge bet that the European Union has made on Ukraine. As quite often with the European Union, we have gone into this huge bet without recognizing it as such, as it happens quite often. I think the only real will that we showed towards Ukraine was moving ahead with this association agreement. But then when things became more difficult, and of course we tried with the whole international community to do our homework in terms of financial assistance, etc. But listening to or looking at the way all things happened during last year, with repeated calls from the Ukrainian Authority for more financial assistance, for even more military support. Remember, at some point, President Poroshenko asking for a peacekeeping force from the EU, and so on and so forth. The EU was somewhat stuck in the way it had set up its own assistance and having great difficulty in moving away from this. If you look at the 3 or 4 instruments we had at the time, which was a trilateral discussion with Russia and Ukraine on gas and on trade, the setting up of what we call the support group, the other Peter Balázs, with his team, and I would say the Normandy format with the 2, Germany and France, trying to help to find a way out and setting up the Minsk, what we called the Minsk II agreement. We were there with all these instruments, but looking as if they were not biting on reality to some extent. It was very difficult at the time. Now, I totally agree with what Oksana and Peter and Balázs has said on this. It is that we are at a very interesting moment when a glimmer of hope is appearing. The support group I was talking before now seems to be working in a better way, having direct contacts with the different Ukrainian administration, finding its way in bringing technical expertise, cooperation. The trilateral negotiation on gas seemed to have been rather successful. Trade, it's a bit more complicated, because as we are approaching the end of the year, when the trade component of the association agreement will have to be started, maybe something will happen. And slowly the Minsk II agreement is showing some successes, delivering. Let's be very careful. We have not reached the other side of the river. We're really in the middle of it. But the ceasefire is holding at the moment. Withdrawal of heavy equipment is going on. On the political side, perspective maybe of a way out of the present confrontation between local election in the rest of the country, and local election in Donbass seems to be moving forward. I mean, 1 year ago, if we only had one of these glimmers of hope, we would have been very happy. Now we have several of them. So it seems to me that the bet you were talking about, at least for the moment, is in a better shape than it was 1 year ago. And I think that's very important for the morale of the European Union as such, who seem to have this hot potato on their hands and didn't know exactly how to deliver. Now, let's be honest. Apart from the real efforts that have taken place in Ukraine, and I think we should pay tribute to these efforts that have taken place, a lot of what's happening at the moment on the ground in a way of a more positive evolution has a lot to do, I think, also with external factors. The drop in gas price, I think, has played in our hands because it has put a lot of pressure on Gazprom and more generally on Russian authority. I personally think, even if I don't think we should make too much of a link, but the Russian increased intervention, military intervention of Syria, I don't think they have all that military capacity that allowed them to play on two fronts at the same time. So it seems to me that they are somewhat accepting to have less grip on Ukraine because they have to think about other events taking place in Syria. And maybe we could find other events. But I think this has been, to some extent, playing also into our hands. Now, what next, going from there on? What should be the next move? Internal reform. How could Europe maybe be more proactive in supporting even more what is going on at the moment? We were talking about fight against corruption. I think there are many issues on which we could maybe try to increase our support, certainly in the central administration. I think also in the local administration and local government, which is asking also for support, can be sometimes quite critical about the central government, and maybe we could bring more technical support there. Even what we have been doing with our CSDP mission, EUAM, which has been rather cautious, prudent, because member states themselves were very prudent. Now that we have seen that it has been working rather well, could we go a little bit further and try to bring more training and more expertise for some of the police forces or gendarmerie or things of that sort, where we could be more forthcoming? I think that could be a way where we could bring more support. The second thing is that we should start thinking about if there is a life after Minsk agreement. You know, Minsk agreement was all very well in trying to de-escalate, and I think that was very useful. I think the natural tendency at the moment is that the Minsk agreement will be pushed forward, because by the end of December and the deadline of December, we wouldn't have succeeded yet in all what the Minsk should deliver. But we should start thinking a little bit more about what we can do after Minsk. And this is where I think we need to discuss among ourselves about the big elephant in the room we never want to discuss about, which is Russia, and which is the future of our relationship with Russia. And of course, there we must not be naive, we must be very careful. But you know, we will only find a way of helping Ukraine to find stability and find its way out of the present difficulty. It will not only be internal reform, even if that is the most important. It will be about, and we know that we don't like to discuss this, but it will be about membership of NATO, accession to the EU, so on and so forth. Russia will not forget about this and will not accept to renounce on all these points. And therefore, the present status quo that can be somewhat to the advantage of Russia as it stands at the moment will not prevail if we don't decide, contrary to a lot of what Europe has been doing, if we don't decide deliberately with a clear understanding of where we want to move from where we are today. In other words, to put it in simple terms, have a strategy and have a vision of what we want to do with Ukraine in the years ahead and what we want to do with our relationship with Russia. As long as we haven't done that, I think we will remain in this sort of strange situation where we are a little bit nowhere, We are trying to deal with short-term measures which are very useful, but we're not looking at the long term, which is still very important and is still looming in the horizon there.
Pierre, you're mentioning the short-term versus long-term approach and the need for a strategy. Apart from the lack of a strategy, do you feel that when you are part of these discussions still and get the information, that there's enough political capital and political will on the side of the Europeans to actually stay in this game for the long term? Because it's quite obvious that this is not going to be a 1 or 2 year project. You know, will all the 28 stay together and play this out for a decade to come?
They have managed so far, let's be honest, even if we're pretty much divided. And I think we have maybe somewhat underestimated what it represented. I know we have our own victories, they're somewhat very small, but the fact that we have managed to keep unity among the 28 on an issue which was very controversial and very divisive among ourselves, sticking to the sanctions against Russia, sticking so far to a clear position on the annexation of Crimea, so on and so forth, has been a little bit of a real success when we see how difficult we've had it was for us to manage other very difficult hot issues. Think in foreign policy about Syria, think about the Greece debt crisis, all these crises that we had to go through the summer. So I think that was really something very valuable. I'm saying that because your point is really about how much divided we are on this long-term strategy. And I think we are pretty much divided because at the end of the day, once again, it's about our relationship with Russia, the way we see the future of the enlargement inside Europe. These are very controversial issues where we're pretty much divided. And I think we will need to find compromises there. They're going to be difficult. We have managed so far. We need to go on with this. But I think we just can't hope that we can keep this long-term vision under the carpet and not by a way or another look at it in an honest way. We have different opportunities to do that. One of them is Federica Mogherini's initiative on the security and foreign policy strategy, where whatever we may say, we will have to look at the relationship with our neighbors, whether it be Mediterranean, whether it be Russia, whether it be the United States. We will have to look at all this and the kind of strategic partnership we want to have with every one of them in the future. So I think it will come back to us even if we try to avoid discussing it, it will be back on us and we will have to take some position. Of course, I know the next question you would ask me, will we not try to fudge the issue as we have done in the past? Of course, we will. We will try to find a way of getting off the hook without compromising our unity. That's the way we have been working for the last 70 years. So if we had found solution about the final and definitive borders of the European Union, we would know about it, and we have never been able to do it. So it will be a little bit about pushing maybe the ball forward and trying to find other ideas in the meantime, other kind of a special association and things of that sort. But at least I think with this initiative on security and foreign policy strategy, we will have to, at some point, look into this. Even if we find compromise solution at the end of the day, at least we should have a good debate on this because we need it.
70 years of fudging it, that's the next Carnegie paper that you're writing. I insist. The long-term issue that you're mentioning, of course, plays out not only in the question of support for Ukraine, but also on the sanctions side. But also on the NATO side, we have friends from NATO here. They also have to be in it in the long term. So the three pillars that all of this rests on, reassurance, sanctions, and support for Ukraine, all are long-term games. And we've never really tried anything like this before. So this is fantastic. Please get your questions ready. I want to say one more thing before I want to see your arms, and that is that, of course, this reform monitor has come out twice, and it will come out more often. This is a one-year project initially. We hope to actually continue it afterwards. But you will have, from now on, every other month, a document of this kind in front of you. Now, please, raise your hands. I will take 2 or 3 in the first round. The first one is here in the first row. And the second one, the lady in the back. And then perhaps Yes, here, and then we go to the rest of the bunch. Let's start with these three. Please introduce yourself and keep it short.
I'll try. Andris Pelš, Latvian PSC ambassador. We just had a wonderful opportunity to be in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago with the Political Security Committee of the EU. And what, of course, we brought was the message of support to reforms and all that. But what was quite striking was that everybody stayed on the message on the Ukrainian side, starting from President Poroshenko and continuing with Mayor of Kramatorsk and even the Prosecutor General was all for reforms. So at least everybody knows what to say to Europe. My question, mostly to Oksana and to Balázs, is we got Pierre's version what we should do from the European side to help Ukraine. What is your feeling? What could we do better from the European side? And finally, I totally agree that we might not be able to agree where exactly the borders of Europe are, but well, as long as Ukraine's in, what does it matter really? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The second question is the lady in the back row over there.
Thank you very much. Olena Pristaika, Ukrainian think tank liaison office in Brussels. So I first congratulate the Carnegie colleagues with the launch of this very useful instrument. So thank you very much. As I always say, the more Ukraine in EU and member states is better. And also we encourage you also to read the Ukrainian analytical digest which we prepare. And my question is, to this main question, on the changes, agents inside of the country. Because I do fully share this opinion that the more people of change we have, the quicker and more deeply reforms we have in Ukraine. So we need to secure this quantitative turn into quality. And my question to all of the participants, which instruments you see from inside and from outside the country to empower those who are already agents of changes inside the country, or who may become with the necessary supports? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you very much. And then this gentleman here in the front row.
Rostislav Demchuk, Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. I would like also pose a question to Oksana Movchan, and just only to confirm. So your council is busy just only with economical reforms, or a huge range from reforms, institutional reforms, reforms in justice field, and information, economy, financial, etc., etc. And which staff? Who belongs to your council?
You know what? I will take another one. I think Jana Kobzova has just put her arms up, and then we'll take the answers after this one.
Thank you very much. Jana Kobzova, working at the European Endowment for Democracy in Ukraine. Thanks for very interesting presentations. I do agree with you that the situation in Ukraine looks much better from Kyiv than from Brussels, and especially when it comes to reforms. I think for reforms to succeed, Ukraine needs two things. It's time and leadership, bolder leadership. And I wanted to ask you about the time factor. How much time Ukraine has doesn't depend on just on the EU or Russia. It depends on the internal politics in Ukraine. The government has lost the constitutional majority. There is again talk about early elections. How do you see the internal politics in Ukraine influencing how far the reforms go? Is there still a support for that? How do you see the parliament's role in approving the reform laws that need to be adopted? There hasn't been much action on that yet. And as you said, again, many of the reforms that are actually happening outside of the legislation process, because the Rada is so unyielding. And the second short question is, Pierre Vimont mentioned the post-Minsk settlement. I wonder if you could talk more about what elements of that settlement, what kind of elements would that constitute, what would that be about? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go first on this one? Oksana.
What you could do better?
You get the mic.
I don't know. You know, we had several meetings today with representatives of EU Commission. You know, again, my personal feeling, and also, I mean, what really I mean, on the one hand, there are many more of us than I had 4 years ago. On the other hand, at that time, you know, we were fine with doing just a few projects. Nobody really demanded from us these huge reforms. I mean, it's been like, you know, we were like a test or a pilot. Now it's absolutely different. The stakes are much higher. I can't even imagine what higher stakes could virtually be. I would really. I'm not ready to offer you a framework, but we really need more people. Or we do have people inside Ukraine, but they're not. You know, they're not ready to work for 2,000 hryvnias. It's around $100. And it's not like, you know, an ordinary job. This job requires competence. This job also requires vision, because it differs from what, I mean, some people, there's a saying that, I mean, you could use your competence from commercial sector to the same extent, I mean, successfully at the government sector. My opinion is that the civil sector is much closer to it's much closer to the government job rather than the commercial sector, we are not. Unfortunately, we failed so far with public service, public administration reform and public service reform. But we're working on it now. Everybody understand that this is a priority. Even those who came to the energy sector, to the education sector, now all understand that this is where the primary focus should be, because this is which will empower those people involved in energy, in education, and other sectors. Quality to quantity. Sorry, quantity to quality. Again, the ball is on our side. We should work. We do have our home assignment with the public service reform. We should do. You know, we did have some, you know, some process organized around building this architecture to do this public service reform. But now it proved that we were working on the law, on the draft bill, but the draft bill is not the reform. And also commenting that some reforms can occur without a law being adopted. The good example is police reform of traffic police. Actually, the guys were out on the street without the law being adopted, and the law was signed few months later after it's been adopted. It's not obvious for broad public, but it's been voted, but it was not a law because it wasn't signed by the president. Leadership. I was also raising the question today that we do need some trainings, and our European colleagues commented that first, show us your plans, build the institutional infrastructure so we understand who are we training. But I wouldn't wait until of course we do struggle, we'll do our homework, but we do have already people who need training, who needs support, because training, it's not only about instruments, it's also about, you should understand that somebody cares. Just a brief comment. I'm also doing, with very few colleagues, another initiative. The idea is to bring, to stimulate foreign language learning in Ukraine. The people who supported us in the first place, they were actually Americans, but were ready to do it for other languages, not only for English. And you know, it was not about the actual financial support. It's just to understand that somebody cares and they do believe in your concept, in your strategy, in your project. This is already a lot. It might sound a bit pathetic, but believe me, it works. We even have our internal, like, meetings with the new people. They are not informal, like, just together after the work. We also do lots of volunteers, but these are these are people who you cannot count on them for a long time. And I don't want volunteers, doing like 24-hour job, 7 days a week. It's not fair, it's not sustainable, and it's a risk. If it's not sustainable, it's a huge risk. We'd rather not start at all. I cannot comment on Minsk, sorry.
Can I ask you one quick question, the one that Jana asked, because we need to hear it from you. How much time do you think the country has? Progress is slow, obviously, and it's tedious. And then the question arises, is time working against you?
The time is working against us, but we don't have any deadlines. It's only about, you should understand that you are already lagging behind. It's about the approach and the attitude. The attitude should be that we cannot take our time. Do we have deadlines? There are some deadlines connected with the commitments with IMF. There are some deadlines important that are connected with the EU-Ukraine association agenda. There are some, deadlines which are connected with the winter season, because we do have to think about how we're gonna survive the winter. I wouldn't mention any specific dates. I wouldn't be trying to connect them to elections, because we do have like every year or so. There are some things that could be done with any kind of the government. You just need to understand where let's say where the lever should be. I always do. I work for the project. I don't work for people, like for a boss, for this person or this person. So I work for the project. I think that this is this approach should be adopted, regardless of what political party or who are the coalition members.
Thanks, Balázs.
Yeah, time. Well.
Yeah, everything. The attention span of the National Reform Council meeting is virtually every aspect of 18 reform, except for security. We don't discuss security. For this purpose, we have national. Everything, yeah. And the members the meeting does not take place if the president, the head of the cabinet, the prime minister, and the head of Verkhovna Rada are not able to participate. These are three people. These three persons should be. They are necessary. They are important member participants, and the rest are the cabinet, the heads of the political parties who are members of the coalition, and 4 representatives of civil society.
Sorry.
It's all online.
It's almost always 60 people participating, 36 sitting around the table who are actually driving the discussion.
Balázs, you want to
one of the most amazing things that you can really find online. This is the most transparent government institution. I don't know how to call it because it's unclear, but intergovernment, like they have the minutes, they have the programs, they have their own self-evaluation in the first 6 months published, which is very critical. That's one of the things which has changed in a certain sectors, more transparency. Unfortunately, there are certain things, and this is connected to the Donbas process, which are not transparent at all. Yesterday, Poroshenko said nothing was signed in Paris, and the moral plan doesn't exist. All right. And that's because that was the message for the Ukrainians. I'm not a traitor because I promised something totally different. It's actually what is happening in Paris. There's no honesty whatsoever. In that, I think it's a big tactical mistake which will catch up sooner or later. And that's what I was kind of referring, that more honesty would be important. Yeah, well, they can talk the talk. For me, it's quite shocking that the prosecutor general talk about reforms. He shouldn't. He should talk about corruption and conviction of corruption cases. That would be the sign of reforms, not that he's committed to reforms. Well, great. But he has specific position to do specific job, right? I'm pretty sure nothing is going to be happening out of the Yatsenyuk process, right? Just nothing. And I don't think that should be actually the case, because either you have proof or not. I don't think there is a proof in the particular case. Now, time. I think time is, and I would like to pick up where Pierre started, that the EU has 70 years of fudging. Well, there is another, and this is, like I really compare Ukraine to the EU. It's a very similar structure, and the Ukrainians saying muddling through. And that's what's going to happen. They don't have the time, yet there's nothing which can push them to find, they have 18 priorities. They have 5 different strategic plans. Everybody's producing their own things. And that's why the facilitation is so much more important. It's the first time somebody's trying to facilitate. It's too little too late maybe, but it's not even an issue. And thanks God there is a macroeconomic stabilization now where more assistance and more, finesse from our side when it comes to the assistance, to know what's going on, is important. Why the Petro Police was a success? Because people had enough knowledge, understanding, and commitment, and money to make it happen. Not because of, they didn't wait for the Ukrainians, but because of that. You see, even the legal process is catching up with those things. The Japanese donated the cars, the Americans donated the uniforms, the Georgians are holding because they have the experience and pushing through. So this is and the Europeans knowing enough because they have enough people on the ground, finally, right? And there is a big change, because when I first time met with the support group, the guy who's supposed to know Ukraine told me, look at Poland. And I said, what about Poland? It's Ukraine, it's different, it's actually very different. Today, if somebody told me, we from Slovakia, I'm from Slovakia, we know Ukraine. No, we don't. We don't, because we spent the last 15 years with the European integration. We didn't even look at Ukraine. It's our biggest neighbor, but we don't know Ukraine. And, everybody who starts, I know Ukraine, well, great. And one of the things which I'm actually missing and what we can do better is where's our institutional memory? That guy who was talking to me, he should actually know that the first talking points, no, we don't know, we need to learn. And those guys who are actually working in these structures need to learn first. There is enough knowledge, but again, it's enough knowledge who is essentially, these institutions which are important together to assist really what Ukrainians need. Second point, responsibility. What Oksana is talking about is responsible. We have kind of difficulties. We can do that. It's a responsible position. Compared to that, to Poroshenko and the leadership talk about Donbass or whatever else. There is no responsibility I can detect in it. And, I'm talking about the new minority because that new minority was essentially having this responsible position, and that is a big change. That's not what the majority does, or this is not what, again, at the highest, particularly at the highest government level, you can detect. The more responsibility we're going to share from the leadership in their communication, what they do, if they're not going to lie on TV, for their own citizens, then we're going to have more and more hope. Third, a dose of realism. We already talked about that. There's a difference. Even Ukrainians, 40% of the Ukrainians are saying that what the government talks and reality is different, right? So we should take a little bit more granted what the Ukrainians think about their own government. But again, this is kind of we're getting there simply because there is now more and more structures and understanding on the ground, which is key to move the assistance, effective assistance forward. And before, what we need, peace. Whether Ukraine can handle the peace is a question. Because, the reason I'm comparing the EU and Ukraine, and I wrote a piece last year which is Ukraine can be united only in diversity. And the constant search for a united Ukraine is just always blowing my mind out. There's not going to be a united Ukraine. Somebody from Lviv not going to live under the Donetsk rules. They just prove it. At the same time, somebody from Donetsk are not going to live under a Bandera flag. They just proved it. So the more we essentially thinking that, that this is happening and not focusing on the diversity, essentially the more we're dividing Ukraine. Pretty much about the EU is the same as well, by the way, when it comes to Ukraine. And my last point, reconciliation. That is not happening, and that is something which should be happening more, unless there is an inter-Ukrainian reconciliation process, right? Which, the government very much afraid, they're afraid to pass the law. That's the reason why Poroshenko has to lie about this. They were very much afraid to pass the constitutional changes because there's a lot of people who just oppose it, and they oppose it with weapons. There's a lot of weapons around, and so kind of the situation is fragile. because of that, but this is the government's responsibility to start the reconciliation. Whether we like the Donbas people, and unless we're calling them terrorists, it's just not going to happen. We're just going to always go back to this, we have to have the victory, which Putin is not going to give Ukraine. That's pretty clear. Donbas, I pretty think that what is happening is, I always thought that Putin, Merkel, and Holland wouldn't go to Minsk to meet with Lukashenko unless something serious is happening. And I always thought that it's going to be on Ukraine whether it can accept the compromise. Whether Ukraine should accept the compromise is an absolutely right question. And I believe Ukraine shouldn't, but it doesn't have the choice. Simply because it's morally an internal conflict with the Russian aggression aided, but still the roots are internal.
Pierre, you want to come in on one of these questions?
No, very briefly on the post-Minsk. I think the first thing is that you have to have a full implementation of the Minsk agreement. We're not yet there. And I think as we look at, as I was saying before, as we're looking at the situation on the ground, to some extent they will have to extend the deadline. Because never forget that before December there should have been an agreement on the Ukrainian Authority regaining control of their borders, and I think we're still far away from that, and we know that. So it's about, first of all, getting the full implementation of Minsk, and it will take time, and to somewhat start a dovetailing process by the end of the Minsk agreement, whereby you will keep somewhere a possibility of a dialogue between these four, and maybe opening it. I'm not so sure that as we move towards the US presidential election, whatever the candidates are and whoever wins, they will look likely at the situation where the US is mostly out of that process. That doesn't fit with the usual US tradition. And you could maybe find a way of adding a few other partners and try to have Ukraine and its future being at the center of an international dialogue and a diplomatic initiative that will allow to look at the long-term picture. Just to rebound on what Balázs was saying, what I find quite fascinating, and it's not only happening in Ukraine, but it is something that we're seeing more and more, is that we're talking on one side about reconciliation, and we know that takes a lot of time. It's a long-term process. And at the same time, we have an acceleration of time acceleration with regard to domestic politics, to the need to adapt constantly to what's happening on the ground. The way we see when we look at the opinion polls, the way political parties are moving up or down very quickly, in a way that we have seen also in Western Europe, in Spain, in Portugal recently. And it's this need to reconcile short-term and long-term processes that I find fascinating in today's Europe and very difficult to manage.
To say the least. Thank you very much, Pierre. I think we have about 15 minutes left, and I would like to take a second round in. The ambassador, this gentleman here, and then Detlef, that's 3, and then we take it from there. Ambassador.
Thank you. My name is Robert van den Mullenbroek, Belgian ambassador, retired. On the debt restructuring agreement, which was agreed a couple of weeks ago with a haircut of about 20%, one of the major stakeholders was left out, and that's Russia. Russia with a claim of about $3 billion US dollar. Now this negotiation is coming up shortly. What is going to be the position of Ukraine, and what can be foreseen if the negotiations don't end up the Ukrainian way? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pass it on to the gentleman here in the second row.
I am Jean-Paul Charlier. I work at the Eastern Europe Department of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So my question is about a specific piece of reform, the signing and ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Just to know if this is a kind of reform that is discussed in the Reform Council and whether you think there is political will to do so.
Thank you very much. And Detlef Pool in the front row, please.
Yeah, Detlef Pool, I'm working for NATO. I have a question regarding the latest monitor that has been just published yesterday, and maybe I can ask a question about this. One thing that struck me was that when you talk about institutional reforms, what you describe is an attempt to have a very strong and, in my view, sometimes questionable presidency. The role of the presidency seems to be very, very strong in what you try to do with, powers to overrule local parliamentary decisions, with powers to interfere into judicial affairs and so forth. Is this the model of the future that you try to install in Ukraine? Is it something that is necessary maybe to hold together this country that you think needs diversity, unity and diversity, or is it a political issue by Poroshenko and his team? Or that's basically my question about the role of the presidency that you try to install.
Thank you very much, Detlef. Final question goes to the back row there.
Yes, hi. My name is Alina, and I would like to ask a bit more about corruption, because it seems like corruption is the main thing and the main issue that a lot of people in Ukraine are worried about. It is also one of the topics that you see being talked about within the EU Parliament, the Commission. And I was really wondering talking about reforms and looking from the Ukrainian government side, what are they doing at the moment to fight corruption? And how do they think to, what is their idea of how to tackle that problem? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let me ask a final quick question to Balázs and to Oksana specifically. Balázs, you said several times that the current government, the president specifically, works with a lot of lies, and he feels compelled to lie on a few things, because that's his way of keeping the peace in a way. But you also said that it's going to catch up with him at some point. When 32% of the people are concerned about the war, but that's all he's talking about, there's a mismatch. What do you mean by catching up with him? What's the result of the catching up? What form will that take? How will he be found out, and what will it mean for him and his credibility? I think we go in reverse order. I would like to give Pierre the first chance to talk, and then move to Oksana, and then give Balázs the final word on this.
No, I don't have much to add, maybe except on rescheduling. We all know that the Russian position, and this is part of a negotiation where maybe Russia will put on the table other interests, and maybe they will find a way out. But that I would leave it to those who will negotiate all this, and some of the international financial institutions can have also their way of convincing Russia at the end of the day to accept this. Now, there may be one point that we should look more into. It is that they may desperately need the money back. So at the end of the day, it could be also ways of helping Russia in some of its present financial difficulties. So I don't know how it will go. I'm not a private party to this, but to some extent you should leave the negotiation going on, because those who managed to negotiate the haircut in the summer were pretty much aware of the Russian position already at that time.
Thank you, Pierre. Oksana.
Yeah, I would add as regards to this 3 billion Russia debt restructuring, if we just were waiting for the outcome of the negotiations. We do have a competent Minister of Finance, and she's got a great team. One of her deputies is ex-EBRD banker, so we'll leave it to them. If they will not succeed, I can't imagine who could. With regards to criminal code, the issue of the anti-corruption reform has been brought to the agenda of National Reform Council meeting already 4 times. We had 14 meetings, 4 times. Anti-corruption is, I would say, they score in the best among the other reforms. Currently, the new laws were adopted, which allow to establish institutional infrastructure to run the reform. It's anti-corruption bureau. It's anti-corruption agency, which will be supervising the lifestyles of the public servants, and it's anti-corruption prosecutor. It's not easy. We do have some, have some issues as to how regarding the nominations for the commissions who are will be electing the prosecutor general for anti-corruption. We'll have in November. We'll have a big conference in Kyiv devoted to anti-corruption. We'll have lots of experts. We'll have people from the government who will be commenting and reporting on the achievements. It is. I mean, this question is. The one which is most often is brought by the civil society. I mean, we are quite. We are ready to. The anti-corruption reform will be closely monitored also by the National Reform Council. But, I mean, we did a lot of talking. Now we just need to. We should finalize with with institutional capability. When we have people in place, we will be ready to ask them questions and wait for the results. Now we're just, trying to set up the stage. Role of presidency, I just didn't catch up on this. It was referred to the monitoring, to the things that were raised in the last monitoring issue.
All right.
Okay, well, I don't feel competent to speak about the debt reconstruction because I think only Finance Minister Yarysko and her team can do that, to be very frank. You can see that the Russians have become much more reconciliatory. They're pushing the rebels for months to comply. And essentially the rebels today said that, what was agreed in Paris, that there's not going to be elections held on October 18, which is just a week or 2 weeks. They postpone it. So obviously it also shows who is calling the shots among the rebels, Putin. It's a clear confirmation, I do think. Rumors are in Kyiv in a very high level in the parliament that even Shevchenko could be released by the end of the year. Now, I do hope that this is going to be happening. So if, Shevchenko, sorry. So if this is going to be happening, maybe the Russians can find a bit more reconciliatory kind of attitude toward a deep restructurization, but please take it as a speculation more than kind of a tactic or a knowledge on my side. Regarding the presidential power, and it's a bit complex because, the president, one of the things which was gone with the Maidan is the legitimacy of the central government. The Maidan, not only Yanukovych was ousted, but the central government as such collapsed. No police, look at the army when they send the army to Donbass. Essentially, this is how the rebels were taking the first tanks, right? It's all over YouTube. You can take a look. Essentially, central authorities collapsed in the Maidan, and this is, by corruption and by negligence, these Soviet government structures are essentially redone. So that's for me, and this is the main thing, like what exactly the kind of strategic focus of the Ukrainian government, whether to bring it back to life, right, or kind of build up the new modern. And I think they're both attempts because, again, it's Ukraine, and they just aren't going to do one thing at the same time. So, yes, the government, and Poroshenko's, just to explain, Poroshenko's attempt is strengthening the central authority as the presidential administration authority, right? And he's trying to use, not by, essentially what the Maidan did, they went back to the old constitution, which is a power sharing between the government and the president. Previously Yanukovych was a stronger president. Essentially, it was a half presidential system, which they changed it. Ironically, I believe if they would kept the Yanukovych constitution, Poroshenko and the reforms would be in a much stronger position, simply because the authority would be stronger for the president to push for reforms, right? Obvious obstacle is the government. It's the Yeltsin government and not the Poroshenko's administration. That being said, the third big issue is the decentralization, and here the president is trying to make its own. It's very interesting that mostly we hear about the Polish advisors and the Polish system, but it's more appeared to me as a French system. When we took a look, well, the president's going to have their own prefects, right? Even they gonna call it prefects, who are going to make sure that the president has a final word. They can even essentially cancel if it's used the constitution, this constitutional change. They can even cancel decisions of the local authorities if it's not corresponding with the constitution. And it's going to be on the prefect, the president's man, to decide about that. So it's a kind of, again, we're going to continue this decentralization at the same time the president wants to keep in order. Why this is important? Because, again, it's the post-Soviet Ukraine. What we see is a post-Soviet Ukraine is over, right? And what kind of Ukraine we're going to see is the question. And here the decentralization for me is a key thing. The annexation of Crimea is not a coincidence from this viewpoint, that there was a conflict, a war in Donbass, which was a state in the state always, that there was a shooting in Mukachevo, which is another state of the state, only at the EU border in Hungary and Slovakia, right? I mean, these are state of the state regions, always could, it's essentially run by a feudal landlord. Kyiv does not have the subsidies and the resources for keeping the subsidies. So the decentralization gives a chance to rebuild the relationships with the regions, politically, economically, and so on. It doesn't, I don't think that it does threaten Ukraine as a country or a territorial integrity. I think Donbass was essentially really the final warning that this can end badly, and this is not what the elites want, and this is not what the people want. Everybody is afraid of a third Maidan, which would be a catch-up. It would be a third Maidan, but I think it's more a risk because really people have no appetite, have no more resources. There is not even the elites are trying to be risk-averse. So putting it together, the main thing is modernizing the state, right? Again, with the post-Soviet collapse. The second is rebuild the relationship with the regions. For example, here Saakashvili, what Saakashvili does is dangerous. Not because he's pushing for reforms, but he wants more authority he actually has. And everyone else will want that too if you're a governor. They're going to go, Balog are going to go to the president. If Saakashvili wants, I want it too, right? So I think, like watching the regions and the decentralization process is going to be the key thing. And so modernization of the state, rebuilding the regional relations between Kyiv and the regions, and making sure that the regions has the necessary financial and other kind of means, self-means, to organize themselves. And that should be, if Odessa lives according to Odessa, and Chernigov lives according to Chernigov. And that's going to make sense in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Balázs, for these very interesting last words on this. We conclude here, knowing full well that we haven't answered really anywhere near the appropriate number of questions that we should have answered. I hope that all of you stay with us for drinks and a couple of nibblings that we will serve. I want to thank Balázs and Pierre for coming over, but I want to especially thank Oksana for coming over from Ukraine. This town, Oksana, believes that it knows something about the difficulty of reform. And, we have, I think, learned something from you, how difficult reform can really be, not only from what you said, but also, from the way you said it. And that was hugely useful for us and a great, help for the debate over here. Thanks for coming over. Thank you again for coming over to Carnegie. We will continue the debate on Ukraine, obviously, not only with the Reform Monitor, but also with other events, and you will find invitations coming your way fairly soon. For now, thanks for showing up, and thanks for staying.